Hello, and a big warm welcome to the Guardian Doula's Diary podcast. My name is Angela Deuce, or Angie. I'm your host and the founder of Guardian Doula. I'm a certified birth and postpartum doula and childbirth educator based on Sydney's Northern Beaches and serving women and their families all throughout Sydney. This podcast is an honest collection of the stories and experiences of birthing women and the professionals that support them to empower, equip, and inspire us all. Let's get into it. Hello, here we are for another episode. I'm really excited about this one. We're going to be talking about the Cascade of Intervention today and what you need to know about it. I think this is a hugely important thing to be learning about while you're pregnant, because so often women don't learn about it before they give birth. They learn about it by going through it. And once you've gone through the Cascade of Intervention, it's a bit late because the Cascade of Intervention has kind of already happened. So I want to break this down a little bit today. The Cascade of Intervention is a term that can be thrown around quite a lot in birth circles, but I want you to really understand what it means. And then, of course, most importantly, I want to help you understand how you can avoid it in your own birth experience if you're hoping to have a very natural birth. So before we dive into this, I just want to remind you, if you are in Sydney, I offer in-person birth support and childbirth education. And then if you are outside of Sydney and you still want to work with me, or if you're in Sydney and you just want more, I am running a live online workshop on Thursday, the 21st of November. It's called the How to Have an All-Natural Empowering Birth Workshop. And the whole aim and focus of this workshop is basically for me to just be teaching you everything that I know and everything that I teach my clients that has helped them to have empowering, beautiful, physiological births, which is quite rare. If we look at the statistics, we know that empowering physiological births are not something that very commonly happen. In particular, if you're giving birth inside of the hospital system, which I think the current stat is that 97% of Australian women do. So this workshop is going to be so helpful to give you the exact tools and the exact information and strategy that you need to make it really likely that you will end up with the birth that you hope for, instead of what I very commonly see and hear about is, I guess, women just kind of leaving it up to chance and being like, oh, you can't control birth. What's going to happen will happen and whatever. But the reality is that knowledge is power, and there is so much that you can control about birth. And if you put the things in place that you do have control over, then you give yourself a way better shot of having the birth experience that you hope for. So it's really important. I think a huge part of avoiding the Cascade of Intervention, which we'll talk about later, but a huge part of avoiding this is just having the right knowledge and the right support in place. So if you are pregnant, if you're hoping to be pregnant, and you are keen to have a really empowering and as natural as possible birth experience, then this workshop is absolutely for you. Even if you're a doula and you're helping women do this, then you could hugely benefit from this workshop as well. So definitely head to my website and grab a ticket. There's a VIP ticket option, which will get you the workshop itself, which goes for an hour. And then after the workshop, I'll also be doing a live Q&A. So the workshop is live, but I'll also be doing a live Q&A as well, where I'll be answering any questions that you guys have. And the VIP ticket holders also get a workbook as well that's got lots of extra information and extra activities. If you've seen my Instagram stories, I actually quite frequently show this workbook that I bring to my clients when we do our sessions together. And a lot of people contact me being like, oh my goodness, is this workbook for sale? It looks so good and so helpful. And it's not really for sale by itself, because I feel like I need to walk you through the content and really explain everything and use proper examples and stuff. But a very, very similar version of this workbook is what will be given to the VIP ticket holders. So if you've seen the workbook and thought oh my goodness, I really want to get my hands on that, make sure that you get a VIP ticket. But getting into the topic of this episode, which is the Cascade of Intervention, let's kind of start with the basics and define what this Cascade of Intervention really is. So essentially, the Cascade of Intervention is this term that we use for when a series of medical interventions happen during labor or birth where one intervention has kind of led to another. So it's like this domino effect that can happen where you start off with intervention 1, and then intervention 1 leads to intervention 2, which leads to intervention 3, and it kind of continues until you are quite far from, I guess, what you would have maybe imagined your birth to be like, and quite far from what you had hoped for. And also, before I get into an example of the cascade of intervention, because I feel like it's helpful to really map out like what this commonly can look like and give you an example so that you kind of get a feel for like, okay, cool, I see how this actually could play out. I do just want to call out the very obvious fact that not all intervention is bad, okay? And I'm certainly not saying that. I feel like when we have conversations like this, there's always someone in the peanut gallery who loves to be like, well, not all intervention's bad. And like my neighbor's sister's cousin's friend's daughter, her baby's, whatever. This intervention saved her baby's life. And like, I'm not saying that that's not true and that there is not a place for intervention. That's never what I'm saying. I am someone who values medical intervention when it is warranted or when it's wanted, when it's required. There's a lot of helpful intervention that can happen. I'm certainly not saying otherwise. I always use this example. I feel like it just is helpful for you to know that when I say this stuff, like this is coming from someone who genuinely will accept intervention when it is warranted, right? So the example that I use is my daughter. I have 4 kids, and our 4th baby, when she was born, she had a whole lot of health issues and complications that happened for her. And so she literally was on continuous oxygen for 4 months straight as a baby. She's still a baby. She has a feeding tube still. She's had a surgery. Like, I am not someone who, when medical intervention is required, I am not going to turn my nose up at that and be like, well, intervention is just silly, and like, of course not. There is a place for these things, and I'm not saying otherwise. So I just wanted to call out what I hope is obvious. But again, like, there's always that person who likes to say like, oh my goodness, this is such a dangerous message that you're saying. Like, of course there is a need for these things sometimes. So yes, there is a need for these things sometimes. I'm not saying otherwise. So I just wanted to kind of put that disclaimer out there. And there's so many ways that you can work out whether or not an intervention is warranted. There are certain questions you can ask. There is a whole thing that I teach my clients around navigating this and figuring out like, okay, is this just something that you are suggesting because it's your hospital's policy and it's not necessarily evidence-based? Because not every hospital policy is evidence-based. We know that it can often take up to 17 years for evidence to then become hospital policy. So just because something is the hospital's policy doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually what the evidence says and supports, which is a whole nother can of worms in itself. But yes, that disclaimer aside, let's chat about an example of what the cascade of intervention can sometimes look like. I think one of the most common ones that I see and hear about is that we start off with bringing labor on prematurely, right? And so this can be things that are seemingly innocent, like maybe it's a stretch and sweep, right? We have a stretch and sweep. We say, okay, let's see if we can like do a stretch and sweep to put your body into labor. Or maybe you go and you get hardcore acupuncture to like with the intention of just putting yourself into labor. Or maybe you go and do what's called the midwife's brew, where you go and like drink this concoction that has castor oil in it. If you want to hear about how that can sometimes go down, you can go and listen to my birth story that I posted on this podcast an episode ago, where I share my birth story with my first baby. I went and drank castor oil and did this, and this literally was my experience, and I know that it's the experience for so many women. So however you bring labor on prematurely, let's say that's how we start, right? We go, okay, I want to get this baby out. And so we bring labor on prematurely. Oftentimes what happens when we intervene in that way, that's intervention 1, right? So that's the start of this kind of domino effect, if you want to picture it that way. We bring labor on prematurely, and then sometimes what we see is that because your body wasn't quite ready to go into labor, it can take really long. And so things are taking time to progress. And so then maybe the team goes, okay, look, we want to speed things up a little bit. Why don't we break your waters? Or why don't we speed your labor up with Syntocin? So that's the medication that they use to induce labor or to augment labor, which just means to speed it up. Then let's say now we've administered this, and so then often we end up in a bit of a fork in the road where either the baby kind of doesn't respond very well to that medication and baby starts to show some signs of distress, or maybe the baby's coping really well, but when we speed labor up or when we augment labor, oftentimes the mum starts to kind of struggle with the pain and the intensity more. And so the mum might then request an epidural. Let's say the baby, let's say we started the Syntocin and baby became distressed. A lot of the time that will end up in a cesarean. But let's say baby doesn't show signs of distress and it's just, mum's just struggling with the pain. Maybe then we have an epidural, right? Again, not saying that the epidural itself is bad, not saying that speeding up labor is bad. There is a place for all of these things. I'm just giving an example. So mum gets the epidural. What does the epidural mean? That means, now we are hooked up and we are attached to a machine that's administering the medication, which means you have less movement, you're less mobile. And we know that the movement of the mum throughout labor has a direct impact on the baby's position and just on how labor progresses in general. So now mum is hooked up to a machine. You've probably been put on monitoring and stuff. So you're less mobile than you were beforehand, which then means that it's likely that baby's position will become compromised. Sometimes the epidural can slow things down a little bit. And then, this is how this cascade can go. Sometimes because the mum's movement has been restricted a little bit, we see things like malposition, which means the baby, isn't in as ideal of a position as maybe they otherwise would have been had the mum been using active birth positions, so being upright, forward leaning, moving around during your contractions, things like that. And we then see with epidurals much higher rates of instrumental deliveries and episiotomies and things like that. So you can see how in this example, one intervention has led to another, right? So we started at the beginning of this cascade with a seemingly innocent intervention, which was bringing on labor before your body went into labor on its own. And then that has led to intervention 2, which has led to intervention 3, which you go kind of down this domino effect and you follow the dominoes and you end up birthing on your back with an episiotomy and instruments. And it's that's just not the birth that you had envisioned. And you probably weren't aware necessarily that starting that cascade at the beginning and bringing labor on prematurely, you probably didn't expect that you would end up where you ended up. But this is something that very, very commonly happens. And of course, it's not to say that every time you go into, you kind of put yourself into labor, you may still have a physiological birth. These things don't never happen, but it is certainly true that very, very, very commonly what we see is that one intervention leads to another. It's just, that's how it is. That's what the research shows. You can't really argue otherwise. If you argue otherwise, you're blatantly denying what the statistics show. So I hope that explanation kind of helps you to wrap your head around what this can look like, this pattern that often happens. Odds are, you've maybe experienced this yourself or you've heard about it from other mums because it is very common, especially in a hospital setting. So I think it's important to understand that this is something that happens so that you can then put the things in place that are going to prevent it. And I think it's also helpful to understand why this is so prevalent. I think a big part of why it's so prevalent is because we, as a culture, so often just view birth as this medical event that is inherently dangerous. And we forget that that's actually not the case. We forget that birth is a normal physiological experience that your body knows how to do really well. 9 times out of 10, women don't need intervention to give birth. It's like vomiting. Your body knows how to vomit. Your body knows how to fall asleep. Your body knows how to blink. Your body knows how to make your heart beat in a rhythm that makes sense. It's a normal bodily function, giving birth. And I think We have hugely over-medicalized birth in our culture, and again, especially in the hospital system, there can be this focus on managing labor in a way that kind of fits a certain medical model, which may not always honor the natural rhythms of your body. Another reason that this cascade is so prevalent is, I think, because of the time pressure that is placed on birth. This plays a huge role. Lots of hospitals have really strict timelines for labor, and when labor isn't progressing according to that formula that they have set up, then these interventions like breaking your waters artificially or, starting Syntocin or whatever, these things can be suggested to speed things up, and then bang, there we go with the cascade. Another factor, I think, and this honestly I think is the biggest one, because if you get this one right, then you are less likely to kind of fall victim to the other things. But this other factor is lack of preparation. So, especially in first-time mums, when you're going through all of this, for the first time, I think, if we're honest with ourselves, I think a lot of us looking back on our first births, maybe we thought that we were really informed going into it, and then you go into it, you fall victim to the cascade, and you go, oh my gosh, I thought I was so informed, but I actually had no idea what I was doing. That is a very, very common thing that I hear. It's definitely what I experienced, and again, the research shows that this is a very common thing. So birth education is something that comes in here and is very important. I think, when you have a really solid understanding of what your options are, the risks, the benefits, the way that, intervention A can impact on your birth outcomes, and maybe how intervention B might be more suited to what your end goal is or whatever. When you have a really deep, solid understanding of these things, and you have all the right things in place, right? So you've done good birth education, you've got a doula on your birth team, you are in a model of care that makes sense for you, then you give yourself a much better chance at this. So I'm kind of already jumping ahead a little bit into sort of part 3, which is how you can avoid the cascade of intervention. And the thing when it comes to avoiding the cascade of intervention is that knowledge is power. When you have, like I said before, when you have quality birth education and you've got the right support like a doula, you can make informed decisions throughout your pregnancy and throughout your labor that can help you to avoid unnecessary interventions that maybe weren't required in the first place. So let's talk about birth education, because this is one of the best ways to ensure that you're not caught off guard when you're in labor and this cascade kind of just happens to you. Education helps you to understand what to expect, what your options are, what risks and benefits come with each intervention. And it also helps you to recognize when things are happening for a medical reason that makes sense, versus when maybe they're just happening because this is convenient for the hospital staff, or maybe this is just the protocol, right? The more you know, the more empowered you are to make the decisions that align well with your situation, with your birth goals, etc. So you might be thinking okay, but where do I get this information? My best advice is to not get your birth education from the hospital. That may be a controversial thing to say, but honestly, all of the hospital classes that I have attended seem very focused on the medicalization of birth, and it's very this is our policy on this and this is our approach on that, more than, okay, this is how birth actually works and here's how you can optimize the process to give yourself the best chance at having a physiological birth. So I think outsourcing when it comes to your birth education is really important. There are so many really, really good birth courses that you can do that will empower you with information that is needed to give yourself the best possible chance at these things. So, do my workshop, do private hypnobirthing or calm birth classes. There's so many. And I'm always happy to point women in the right direction. If you want to message me and get some recommendations, I can always help you with that. I provide birth education as well to all of my clients. So I think number 1, be intentional about where you are getting your information from is very, very important. Another super important piece of this puzzle is the support that you have. So hiring a doula is super important. We know that the research shows that doulas do improve birth outcomes. Doulas decrease rates of cesarean. Doulas decrease your likelihood of medical intervention overall. I think, putting doula support in place is a really, really huge part of avoiding this cascade of intervention. And I cannot stress enough how important and how helpful doulas are when we're talking about this stuff. I feel like it wouldn't be it's I think an essential piece of this puzzle is having doula support. Having a doula means that you have someone who can help you ask the right questions, remember the right questions, make sure that you're informed, help you navigate any decisions that come up during labor when, emotion is high. And oftentimes, like, in the intensity of the moment, everything can feel like it goes out the window a little bit. I think so many parents find that, like, they'll say to me, oh my gosh, we really felt so ready and so empowered going into this, and you helped us to be so prepared, but we're so glad that you were there with us in the moment. Because it's very similar to like a first aid course. You might do the first aid course and feel really, really solid on exactly what to do. But then when you are faced with the person in front of you in an emergency situation, it can feel really hard to recall everything and to think clearly and remember when emotions are high. And, in the heat of the moment, it can be hard to kind of remember very clearly all of the information that you have. Whereas a doula can help you be really calm. It's, birth is something that we see all the time. We are so used to birth. We're around it all the time. We are like not fazed by the intensity of labor. So I think, the research proves that having a doula is a really, really huge piece of avoiding this cascade of intervention. So if you're sitting here listening to this and you're like, okay, what can I do now? These are my tips. I would say take a really solid birth preparation class, whether that is in person or online. Just make sure that it's really thorough, that it's really evidence-based, because education will absolutely help you to know what to expect, and it will empower you to make decisions that align really, really well with your values and with your hopes for birth. Number 2, hire a doula. Like, do not skip this one. It's so important. I really can't emphasize enough how crucial this is. Number 3, you can ask the right questions at your prenatal appointment. So in this workshop, I'm going to be spending a pretty solid amount of time teaching you guys how to ask the right questions and how to accurately and safely judge when, this really is time to accept an intervention, and when this is important that we accept an intervention, versus, like I said before, is this just a hospital policy that isn't really based on good evidence? Or is this something that's just convenient for the provider and maybe not, in my best interest? So I'm going to help you kind of work out how to ask those questions and how to navigate these things. And then the 4th thing that I'll call out that is so important in avoiding this cascade is that you need to create a solid birth plan. I think, again, this could be a whole nother episode on itself, on its own. And I think I probably will do another episode about this, about creating a birth plan and like how to create a good birth plan and why it's important. In a nutshell, though, a birth plan is essential because it's the communication tool that your care providers are going off, right? Like, you can't expect your midwife to walk into the room and know you really well. Like, you can't expect that she's going to walk in and be able to read your mind and know that you are someone who really wants things to be natural, that you want things to be sort of as low intervention as possible. How does she know that if you don't have a solid birth plan where you have mapped out exactly what your hopes are, exactly what your intentions are? I think a lot of people are nervous to make a birth plan because they're like, oh, well, nothing goes to plan anyway. Like, why make a plan? Oh my gosh, that's the worst attitude ever, because a birth plan is a communication tool. That's what it is. And it's really important that you write down what your hopes are, what your non-negotiables are. And if your care team is on the same page and they know what you want and what you are hoping for, then they can tailor the way that they're caring for you accordingly, So really, really important that you have a birth plan. Don't skip that step. So that's 4 things that you can do straight away that you can start implementing to kind of avoid this cascade of intervention that we so commonly see and hear about. And, in the end, I think like birth is such a personal experience and it's such a powerful experience. I think women remember their births forever. You can go up to a granny on the street who's had kids and ask her about her births, and she will tell you how she was treated and how it went down and how she was made to feel, and whether she looks back on that day and smiles and cherishes the experience that she had, or whether she looks back on that day and like cringes and goes, oh my gosh, that was one of the most awful experiences of my life. Like, you don't forget your birth, you forget some things and you forget, like I think, women say all the time, like, oh gosh, you really forget the pain and you forget so quickly like how intense it really is. And then when you go on to have another baby and you go into labor again, you're like, oh my gosh, I remember now. I feel like I forgot how intense this was and now it's coming back to me. Like when you're in it, you go, oh my gosh, yes, this is what this was like, so you do, I think you forget like part of it, but you certainly remember the overarching experience so much, like so much. Your birth experience marks you forever. It really does. So it's important that, we put the right things in place to give you the best possible shot at a really positive, empowering experience. Like birth is such a beautiful rite of passage that we have as women. And I think it's important that we like redeem that, I think there's so much about the beauty and the sacredness of birth that has been lost in our culture. And yeah, anyway, I'm fully rambling now. I'll just wrap this up. But I hope that this kind of helps you to understand a little bit more about what this cascade of intervention is, because it's a term that I think does get thrown around a lot. And I think, it's important that you understand, like, what can that actually look like and what does it actually mean and how do I avoid it? So come to the workshop. I would love to teach you exactly how, in great detail, how I help my clients to avoid this. I really hope to see you there. And if I don't see you there, I'll see you next week on the next episode. I will actually call out as well, sorry, just in case I forgot to say it before. If you can't make it to the live workshop that's happening on Thursday, it will be recorded. So you can still buy a ticket and then the recording will be sent out afterwards as well. So definitely still grab a ticket even if you can't make it like during the live time, because you can still certainly access all of the content afterwards. So don't let that stop you if the time slot doesn't suit you. But yes, I will leave it there. Hope you have a beautiful rest of your day whenever you are listening to this. And wishing you all the best for your birth. Thanks for joining us for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a rating or a comment, and I can't wait to see you back here for the next one.